Inside of Westminster Abbey, there are many different kings and queens who are interred and buried inside huge tombs and monuments to them. Some of the burial vaults inside of the Abbey are filled with high-status families and important people's coffins contained within. Some of these coffins have been, over the past centuries, opened, and what was discovered was remarkable. For example, Edward I's tomb was opened, and centuries after his death, his body was said to have been in a remarkable condition. But there is a much darker story from within the Abbey's history that is disturbing and is not as well known. Catherine of Valois, the wife of King Henry V, the incredible English warrior king and victor of the Battle of Agincourt, was left unburied and above ground, not being interred in a grave or a tomb, despite the fact she was a queen. She was left this way for 400 years, and things got worse as her remains were even defiled and were displayed to tourists who paid a fee. It was a macabre scene, and people could pay to even kiss the corpse of a medieval queen. But how did this happen, and why did this happen? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Catherine of Valois was the youngest daughter of the King Charles VI of France, and she was a French princess. When she was a teenager, negotiations took place to marry her to the future King Henry V. She travelled to England, and she would marry King Henry in 1420. But she was married to someone who was considered one of the strongest commanders of the 100 Years' War, and Henry V was embroiled in the conflicts between England and France that had been going on for some time. Henry V went to France to wage war, and he won the spectacular Battle of Agincourt, despite being outnumbered, and Catherine, who was said to have been a very attractive woman, captured the eye of Henry V. The pair married on the 2nd of June 1420 at Troyes Cathedral, and Catherine would then travel to England with her new husband, and she was crowned the Queen of England in Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of February 1421. Henry then, months later, went back to France to continue his war against the French, and he left even whilst Catherine was pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, the future King Henry VI. Her husband would never see the child, and he died on the 31st of August 1422, despite being just 35 years old. Catherine was 20, and she was left a widow and also a queen dowager. Her son became the new King of England, and English occupied France, despite being very young. But Catherine was seen as a catch to many people, especially nobles who thought they could marry her and then become a power behind the throne. The man who Catherine of Valois later married would be Owen Tudor, the man who would become the grandfather of the Tudor dynasty. The marriage of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois was incredibly controversial at the time, and they went on to have at least 6 children. But on the 3rd of January 1437, Catherine of Valois died after giving birth in London, and it was claimed that she was buried in the Old Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. She may have known that her death was on the horizon, as she travelled to Bermondsey Abbey to seek a cure for an illness which was troubling her, and she also made a will 3 days before her death, indicating that she knew what was coming for her. After her death, her body was embalmed and her internal organs were removed to keep away decay, and the chest cavity was then filled with herbs and other spices, and her body was then wrapped in a thick wax-covered cerecloth to protect it. Sometimes these cerecloths would protect remains perfectly for hundreds of years. The plan, as mentioned, was to bury Catherine inside of Westminster Abbey, and following her funeral, she was given a second service and ceremony, and was to be laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey near to her husband, Henry V. But she was then dug up and disinterred. The tomb was only briefly a place for Catherine to be laid to rest, as her grandson, Henry VII, demolished the Old Lady Chapel where this tomb was, and Catherine was disinterred and dug up. And her body, which had been in the ground for around 50 or 60 years, had been decaying, but the coffin and the wooden box was said to have been in a bad way. Because of this, her body was removed from the coffin and was placed inside of a wooden chest, which was lined with lead from the old chapel roof. This chest was then just laid next to Henry V's tomb, and it was left here for around 300 years, and there were no plans then for a new tomb for her body. Henry VII may have left her remains out, as he wanted to distance himself from Catherine and the scandal around her marriage to Owen Tudor, his grandfather. He did want her to be buried alongside him one day, though, and it was claimed that in our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and especially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to Henry V. Our body, therefore, to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried. Presumably, when Henry VII finished the Lady Chapel, he then wanted Catherine of Valois buried inside of here, where he one day would be laid to rest also. But Henry VII then would not carry out the building of a tomb, and he chose not to bury her, and following Tudor monarchs also did not do anything about Catherine's body. The chest she had been buried inside was in 2 pieces, and tourists and worshippers who travelled to Westminster Abbey would, for a small fee, be shown the remains of Queen Catherine when they asked. It became quite profitable for people inside of the abbey, and it was claimed that the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, visitors to the abbey claimed that Catherine's body had bare skin and was naked with no clothes, alluding to the fact she had been buried naked, her body just wrapped in the cerecloth shroud. Some believed that Catherine was a woman who was being punished by her non-burial, and that her second marriage went against the wishes of a king, her deceased husband. One person who saw her body claimed that, sensible of her fault in disobeying her husband, it was her own desire and pleasure that her body should never be buried. If so, it is pity that woman, especially a queen, should have her will therein, whose dust doth preach a sermon of duty and mortality to all. People for centuries continued to see her body and remains, and the famous writer Samuel Pepys, who of course kept his famous diary, even kissed the remains and corpse of Queen Catherine of Valois, and he wrote, "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I went to the abbey, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." The shocking defilement continued, and further mistreatment in the 18th century claimed that her body was torn into pieces by a group of young students who messed with her corpse, and it was also said that her body became a shapeless mass of whitish colour because of the desecration. Her body was placed inside of a vault in 1788, but during the reign of Queen Victoria, this was opened, and people yet again opened Catherine's coffin to see if it was actually her body stored inside of the Villiers vault. The coffin had been placed on a pile of other coffins, and this box had yet again rotted and had stuck to the other coffins. Catherine's remains, once taken out of the vault, were analysed, and many pieces of her had been taken and gone missing. Some claimed that they had been covered in lime, but other parts had been taken. The front part of her skull had been taken, and one part of her skull was found lying, resting on her pelvis. A number of her backbones had gone, and one of her ribs, except one, had been taken. 2 of her right arm bones had been taken as well, and a clavier had been stolen, and a bone from her pelvis was placed in this position. It was a complete desecration, and her body had been pillaged. Catherine's legs were found wrapped perfectly and in perfect condition, and she was then placed inside of a new coffin ready for reburial during Queen Victoria's reign. It was then carried into Henry V's chapel to be interred. It was claimed during this procession that "it'll be striking and an impressive scene, which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains and followed Mr. Poole, and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hand one small lantern to light us, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her body, or what was left of it, was interred finally inside of a large and thick coffin made from English oak, and an inscription in this final burial place documented that her remains had been unburied for 400 years. It states on the tomb that it is the latest royal tomb in the Abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should be at length brought to an honourable end. Requiescat in pace. For the final time, Queen Catherine of Valois was interred and buried inside of a tomb where she will remain for the rest of time. But being brutally honest, there was little left of her to be placed inside of this tomb, which today can be very easy to miss. She was a Queen of England through marriage, and she was the mother of a king who would be deposed during the Wars of the Roses, but perhaps her greatest legacy is the fact that she was the grandmother of the Tudor dynasty and Henry VII, a man who would end the Wars of the Roses. Her body in death was subjected to harrowing treatment and barbaric and disturbing defilement, but for 400 years her body remained unburied above the earth. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.